On November 28th, in 1953 at 2:30 in the morning, a man sharing a room with a colleague of his at the Statler Hotel got out of bed in his underwear, walked to the door, turned around, sprinted through the room, dodged two beds and a radiator, and then launched himself through closed shades and a glass window, twisted midair to look up at the night sky as he fell, and hit the pavement 10 floors below. He survived the fall for a minute, and as blood pooled around him and the hotel night manager leaned over him, he desperately tried to speak, but failed as he choked on his own blood. The police arrived shortly after and found the room associated with the broken window, room 1018A. They barged in and found it empty and quiet, except for a man sitting on the toilet, his head resting in his hands. The police questioned him, and he told them his name was Richard Lashbrook, and that he had been sleeping, heard a noise, and woke up to an empty room, the window glass shattered, and the shades just flapping in the cool November air. When asked who the man was, he said Frank Olson. The police barely spent any time looking into this case. It seemed relatively self-explanatory. He died from jumping out a window. Was there anything else we needed to know? The family was contacted shortly thereafter, and they were told that Olson jumped out the window to his death. A tragic case of a middle-aged man succumbing to the pressures of life and taking his life one night while in New York City. Or at least, that's what the CIA wants you to think, because as it turns out, Frank Olson was employed by the CIA. And I don't just mean employed as in he was a janitor of one of their buildings. I mean he was in deep with the CIA. And yes, this video will discuss all of that. So, it's probably starting to make sense to you now, because I know you heard the story I just gave you guys about Frank Olson's death and realized it was absolute bullshit. And if you're thinking that, you are not alone. You're not the only one. Although in the wake of grief the family may have bought it, the night manager, Armand Pastor, was immediately suspicious as to the circumstances. So he did a little digging. His first big question was, why in the world did Olson's colleague and roommate not come downstairs? Did he even call 911? So, on his quest for truth, he looked at the call log from room 1018A on the night Olson died. Turns out, someone did make a call, but it wasn't to 911. It was to an unidentified recipient in Long Island, and all the caller said was, "Olson's gone." And the reply was, "That's too bad." And then they simultaneously hung up. This is part one of a series where we're going to dive in deep looking at the alleged assassination of Frank Olson, MKUltra and its predecessor projects, Patty Hearst, Project Mockingbird, and how this all comes together to affect our lives right now. So hold on tight and maybe even wear a seatbelt, because this ride is going to get a bit crazy.
Early days of the Cold War, the CIA ordered the creation of a secret program intended to find ways of mind control.
We are starting with the alleged assassination of Frank Olson, and we are going to begin at the beginning, when he was an American civilian who got recruited by the military. Olson was serving as a captain in the U.S. Army Chemical Corps when, in December of 1942, he got a call from Ira Baldwin, his thesis advisor at University of Wisconsin, and also the future mentor of Sidley Gottlieb, who later went on to become the CIA's leading chemist and director of MKUltra. But that's details for another time. Anyway, Ira had been asked to leave his university post to direct a secret program for the development of biological weapons, and he wanted Olson to join him as one of the first scientists at a facility in Frederick, Maryland. See, President Franklin D. Roosevelt had read some intelligence reports noting that Germany and Japan were stockpiling poison gas, and that Russia, Britain, and Canada were beating the US in biological weapons research. And that obviously did not sit well for him. So, shortly after Olson moved, the facilities were taken over by the Chemical Corps, it was named Fort Detrick, and the secret U.S. Army Biological Warfare Laboratories, or USBWL for short, was created. The research done at Camp Detrick and the USBWL was originally overseen by pharmaceutical executive George W. Merck and Ira Baldwin, the professor I mentioned a second ago. The Army's Chemical Warfare Service was given responsibility and oversight over all of this, and as one officer described it, this entire effort was cloaked in the deepest wartime secrecy, matched only by the Manhattan Project for developing the atomic bomb. Olson worked in the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, during World War II with Dr. Harold Abramson, and he specifically conducted experiments on using aerosol to disperse bacteria that caused anthrax, or bacteria related to anthrax. In 1945, Project Paperclip was created, where the US State Department, Army Intelligence, and the CIA recruited Nazi scientists and other German scientists, offering them immunity and secret identities in exchange for work on top secret government projects in the US. Some of these scientists worked at Camp Detrick and with Olson. In 1947, the CIA began its study of LSD on human subjects as a potential weapon, and Colonel E. Kirkpatrick of the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission issued a secret document stating that the agency would begin administering intravenous doses of radioactive substances to human subjects. At this point, people, both civilian and military, were being used with and without their consent or knowledge in these experiments. In the years of 1948 and 1949, Olson helped set up the Special Operations Division, or SOD, at Fort Detrick. The SOD grew lethal cells and cultured deadly viruses with the intent of using them as offensive biological weapons. Some of the projects requested by the CIA included the development of toxic sprays and poisons, testing various pharmaceutical products, and exploring the ability to induce cancer through covert means. Written records were forbidden, and only a trusted few knew about the most sensitive projects. Within the SOD, Olson was tasked with developing new and secret biological means of effective interrogation and warfare. He also became the acting head of this division. Now, here is where he gets connected with Richard Lashbrook. Remember him? He was Olson's bunkmate the night he died. Lashbrook was the TSS Chemical Division's liaison to the SOD. In 1950, Olson was part of Operation Sea Spray, where the U.S. Navy conducted a secret biological warfare experiment by spraying bacteria all over the San Francisco Bay Area in California, thus exposing over 800,000 people to a bacteria associated with anthrax. The goal was to determine how vulnerable a city like San Francisco was to a bioweapon attack. There is speculation that the experiment contributed to 1 death and at least 10 illnesses. But the lawsuit was unsuccessful because there was no direct evidence connecting that death and those illnesses to the operation. And to put this into further perspective for you guys, the Army actually conducted 239 secret open-air warfare tests from 1949 to 1969, which involved dangerous pathogens linked to anthrax. Olson also traveled to Fort Terry, which was a secret Army base off of Long Island, where toxins too deadly to be brought onto the US mainland were tested. Around this time, Olson stopped working with the CIA as a US Army contractor and actually transitioned and began working for the CIA as an employee. Then in 1952, Olson was appointed to the Committee for Project Artichoke, which was the inception of Project MKUltra. Project Artichoke was an integrated CIA program for the development of special interrogations or other techniques for the purpose of controlling an individual without his knowledge. This quote was from Dr. Marshall Chadwell, who was a coordinator of Artichoke. Okay, now I don't want to skip over this section, this whole MKUltra and all of that, but I'm going to anyway, because I will have another very detailed video on Project Artichoke, Project Bluebird, Project MKUltra, all of that. But I need you guys to know that the former two were the predecessors of the infamous MKUltra, and Olson was aware of all of this, and he was involved in all of this. Now, obviously, what Olson was involved in early on is very ethically and morally problematic. But things really start to stack up on the year he died, which was 1953. It really just got worse. Issue after issue, realization after realization. This was also the year MKUltra was established. In early 1953, Olson stepped down as chief of the SOD, his reason being pressures of the job that aggravated his ulcers. That being said, he did stay working with the SOD, but these pressures of the job were really starting to spill over into his family and his life, and his wife and children, they noticed. Okay, so now from here, things get a little dicey on what's alleged and what is verified. So I'll try to keep you guys notified about what's believed, but may not necessarily be known with 100% certainty. It also gets a little complicated because a lot of things are happening all at once, which I said a second ago. Things really start to stack up here and a lot is going on. So in February of 1953, the Chinese broadcasted charges that two captured American pilots had claimed the US was conducting germ warfare against North Korea. Other captured Americans made similar statements. The US government threatened to charge some of the POWs with treason for cooperating with their captors, and after their release, many of the POWs publicly repudiated their confessions, stating those confessions had been extracted by torture, which could have happened. That does happen. But some Korean War POWs refused repatriation and defected, and this made a lot of sense because the POWs that did go back to the US were seen as potential security risks and experienced hostile investigations in search of possible disloyalty. So they were really in a situation, damned if you do, damned if you don't. What followed was honestly a fiasco because, of course, the United States completely denied these allegations and said it was Chinese and North Korean propaganda. And of course, they're going to claim this because germ weapons used in war is and was a breach of the Geneva Convention. On top of this, there is no conclusive evidence that the US did use germ warfare, but also there's no evidence that they did not use germ warfare. Academics have been debating this for forever. But here's the thing, to help you guys better understand what's going on. When the Korean War broke out, the Truman administration increased the biological warfare budget from $5.3 million in 1950 to $345 million for the years of 1951 and 1952. Okay, but wasn't that just for defense? Okay, but get this. In February of 1952, Joint Chiefs of Staff approved the Joint Advanced Study Committee's recommendations on biowarfare, which stated that the U.S. should be prepared to employ BW whenever it is militarily advantageous. And General Hoyt Vandenberg, who was the chief of the Air Force, wrote, "The research and development program is being expedited, and certain offensive capabilities are rapidly materializing." So, you can see why academics debate about this. It's argued that the US, in using biological warfare in the Korean War, was trying to create a contamination belt designed to stop the movement of soldiers and supplies across the 38th parallel dividing North and South Korea. Now, to further contextualize these allegations, we actually have to back up the timeline a bit and discuss this within the context of Japan's World War II biological weapons program. Between 1932 and 1945, Imperial Japan had an extensive BW program that was most famous for Unit 731, which was located directly north of the Korean peninsula. These experiments were gruesome and included infecting prisoners with deadly diseases, amputating limbs, exposing victims to chemical agents and explosives, and much, much more. Most of the victims were Chinese civilians, but it also included Russians, Koreans, and others. Around 14,000 people were killed inside the facilities, and to this day, there are no documented survivors that we know of. On top of this, they employed biological weapons outside the walls of the facilities, thus killing around 250,000 people in Chinese cities and villages. And here's the kicker, which ties all of this together. Although some Unit 731 members were tried by the Soviet Union for war crimes and sentenced to prison, many key figures, including General Shiro Ishii, who led the program, were granted immunity by the United States in exchange for their research. President Truman concealed the unit's crimes and paid stipends to former personnel. Olson and his colleagues at Fort Detrick worked with these scientists, including General Shiro Ishii, on ways to produce and deliver bacteriological weapons. In 1994, right before her death, Alice Olson, Frank Olson's wife, told her children that Korea really bothered your father. And later, in May of 2001, Norman Cornoyer told Eric Olson, Frank's son, that if biological warfare was used in Korea, your father definitely would have known it. Being in special operations at Detrick, oh yes, he would have known it. And then he said, Korea was the key to your father's death. It was where the two secret CIA programs, mind control experiments, and the use of biological weapons came together. So with all of that, like I said, it's still hotly debated over whether the US used germ warfare in the Korean War, and you can come to your own belief as to if they did or if they didn't, whatever you want to believe. But it seems Olson may have at least thought they were, or recognized the risk of this happening, and his family and friends were made aware of this internal conflict that Olson was experiencing. Okay, after all that, now let's get back to the year of 1953, which was the year Olson died, because we are not done with what he experienced and learned leading up to his death. It seems bad now, it actually only gets worse. In May of 1953, Olson witnessed brutal experiments in Porton Down in the UK. The government told innocent soldiers they were being tested for a cure for the common cold, but instead, they administered steadily increasing doses of sarin nerve gas. That being said, the UK government continues to claim that all these subjects were volunteers and that this entire operation was operated to the highest ethical standards of the day. Okay, really quick because I find this comical in a very dark way, but I'm going to put on my lawyer hat here. I just got this. And I'm going to nitpick the shit out of the words used by the UK government. We're going to look at www.gov.uk, and the name of this news story is The Truth About Porton Down. Okay, let's go. Already, I'm like, man, this must be the most trustworthy content out there, right? I mean, we know the UK loves an educated citizenry, and they're very pro-free speech, right? So I can trust this. Anyways, obviously, that's sarcasm. Let's take a look at what they wrote. Okay, first, when discussing human volunteers, they say, since 1916, over 20,000 volunteers have taken part in studies at Porton Down. Well, they're technically not lying, because soldiers did volunteer to be tested on. They just agreed to be tested for a cure for the common cold. They then got hit with a variety of other tests. This is sneaky. The government is saying one thing, hiding behind another. The UK then says, the volunteer program has always been operated to the highest ethical standards of the day. Oh, the ethical standards that were the norm in World War I and World War II? Who established these ethical standards of the day? The Nazis in the concentration camps? Okay, what about what was going on in America and all the shit the US government was doing? Is that the ethical standards of the day? I mean, here's the thing. You have to pay attention to the words being used here, because technically the UK government is not outright lying here. They're just manipulating the words and using your presumptions against you. So you think they're saying one thing, in reality they're saying another thing. And if you know the history, then you're able to apply that, and it makes sense within the context. But anyways, and rant, we'll continue on. Lawyer hat off. Let's keep going. Okay. So, Olson allegedly witnessed these experiments. And so, obviously, that really affected his psyche. Then, in August of 1953, Olson traveled to Berlin and witnessed several brutal interrogations involving torture and the use of drugs. Allegedly, he was among a secret group of Fort Detrick scientists who traveled to Germany to interview Dr. Walter Schreiber, who was the Nazis' anthrax expert who tested psychochemical drugs on concentration camp prisoners. He also may have witnessed Dr. Kurt Blome, the Deputy Surgeon General of the Third Reich, conduct interrogation experiments at Camp Kings, which was a safe house in Germany. And here's the thing, I'm adding a lot of allegedlys and he may have in here, and that's because there's evidence that he witnessed these things, but I cannot concretely say that he did. There are sources that have verified it. There are other forms of evidence, like his passport, that support that he had been in these locations at these times. But at the end of the day, a lot of the stuff is shrouded in secrecy. So, do with that what you will. Upon his return to the US, he confided in a friend and colleague of his at Fort Detrick, whose name is Norman Cornoyer, and I actually mentioned him earlier in this video. Olson apparently said he felt ashamed about what he had witnessed and the experiments he saw, and he compared it to what had been happening to people in the concentration camps. Obviously. In November of 1953, Olson was invited to the Deep Creek Rendezvous. The cover story was that it was a winter meeting for scriptwriters, editors, authors, lecturers, sports magazines, etc. But Olson and everyone else knew this was something else, some kind of top secret meeting. Olson thought it was something about the joint projects of the SOD and CIA involving things like biowarfare and the use of drugs for mind control, likely because the invitees were the men closest to MKUltra. But even the idea that this was a top secret meeting was a cover story for another insidious reality that was lurking in the background. After a big and enjoyable dinner, the group had after-dinner drinks. TSS Chief Dr. Sidney Gottlieb and his deputy served Olson and several others a bottle of Cointreau. The men accepted it and drank while sitting around and chatting about whatever the CIA talks about when they're casually drinking in a cabin in the woods. But once the glasses were all finished, they were told that the Cointreau was laced with LSD. And then what likely ensued was a form of enhanced interrogation meant to figure out who was loyal and trustworthy and who was not. Understandably so, Olson was livid. To him, this further confirmed the immorality of the men for which he worked, and his family noticed. The first night he was back, he seemed desolate. He refused to eat, was distant from his family, and at one point blurted out to his wife, "I've made a terrible mistake." His mood continued to deteriorate in the days that followed. He was reported as agitated, disoriented, and all mixed up about the work he had been doing. He even asked his boss if he should be fired or just quit. On November 23rd, Olson told his supervisor that he wanted to resign. According to his sons, his reasoning was based on ethical concerns regarding the CIA's conduct, including extreme interrogations he had witnessed and the experiment at Deep Creek Lake. And if you're working with the CIA, never mention ethics, because it seems like you're probably going to get killed. Olson was convinced not to resign, and his supervisor and Lashbrook instructed him to see a psychiatrist in New York City. Olson, exhausted from everything he had been witnessing and experiencing in the last few months, agreed. Maybe some time off and a therapist would help him. So he was set to meet with Dr. Harold Abramson, who you may remember was mentioned at the very beginning of this video. He was an allergist and employee of the CIA. Why he was the doctor the CIA chose, I'm not sure. He was not a psychologist, nor was he a therapist. But you can give me your theories in the comments. I obviously have my own. Anyway, on November 27th, Olson and Lashbrook went to New York City and got a shared room at Hotel Statler. That night, Olson called his wife, and according to her, seemed to be in a good mood. He went to bed, and, well, you know what happened after that. Around 2:30 in the morning, he was dying on the New York City sidewalk from jumping out the window. Now, I just told you guys a lot of information, but it doesn't end here, so please stick with me, because although the family didn't do much at first, the CIA was unable to shake the memory of Frank Olson. In early 1975, the Rockefeller Commission was formed under President Gerald Ford to investigate the activities of the CIA and other intelligence agencies. The commission was created in response to a December 1974 report in the New York Times that the CIA had conducted illegal domestic activities, including experiments on U.S. citizens during the 1960s. Now, this report that the commission published was severely altered to protect the U.S. government. That being said, a CIA secretary accidentally handed over a file marked Frank Olson during the investigation. Nice one. In that file, it said that Frank Olson's death was not a homicide nor a simple suicide, but rather a bad reaction to the LSD that he had unknowingly consumed 9 days prior. The thing is, no one on the outside, including his family, knew that Olson had been drugged at the Deep Creek Rendezvous until this file came to light. So, understandably so, they were absolutely shocked and furious, and the family announced they were going to sue the agency over Olson's wrongful death. But the government offered a $750,000 settlement in exchange for immunity, and the family agreed. They also received a formal apology from President Gerald Ford and the CIA Director William Colby at the White House. That same year, Armand Pastor, the assistant night manager at Hotel Statler the night Olson died, wrote the family a letter admitting that Olson's death disturbed him and that the circumstances were unusual. Galvanized by all of this, Olson's son, Eric Olson, dedicated his life to uncovering the truth about his father's death, and as he continued to push forward on this case, more suspicious evidence and coincidences were uncovered. In 1977, it was uncovered that a man named George Hunter White, who was the Federal Bureau of Narcotics Supervisory Agent at Large, was initially in charge of watching over Olson at the Statler Hotel. But he had to leave the city to take care of his mother. In his absence, this one's interesting, a man named Jacques Vonnier stepped in. And I hope I said his name right. He's French, I think. Anyways. Now, Jacques Vonnier, or known as Jean-Pierre Lafitte to the CIA, was a high-ranking member of Union Corse, which was a Corsican-based crime syndicate involved in the international heroin trade network operated between Turkey, southern France, and the United States. On top of that, he was involved in the MKUltra. So, He was a really bad guy who had been flipped by the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, and apparently he actively participated in the criminal underworld while also investigating it. So I'm not really sure how flipped he was. Seemed to be just playing both sides. In 1994, after Alice Olson died, Eric Olson had his father's body exhumed so he could bury it with his mother. At that time, the family decided to have an autopsy performed. The autopsy was performed by James Starrs, a professor of law and forensic science at the George Washington University National Law Center. He searched the body for any cuts and abrasions and found none. On top of that, he found a large hematoma caused by blunt force trauma on the left side of Olson's head and a large injury on his chest. Him and his team concluded that both of these injuries occurred prior to his fall, not during or after the fall. And it's important to note that they didn't find any cuts or abrasions, because remember, apparently he jumped through the window and glass shattered, so you'd think there would be some cuts and abrasions, but there were none. It was just the blunt force trauma to the head and the injury to the chest. Starrs called the evidence rankly and starkly suggestive of homicide. In 1996, the Olsons wanted to sue the government, but the settlement they signed back in 1976 meant that they had forfeited that right. That being said, there was maybe a way around it if they proved Olson's death was a homicide. So, Eric Olson set out to do just that. He persuaded the Manhattan DA, Robert Morgenthau, to reopen the investigation and assign prosecutors to it. But 1 week after the case was reopened, the former CIA director William Colby, a key witness, vanished, with his body eventually washing up after a reportedly suspicious boating accident. And more suspicious activity and deaths followed. Lashbrook vehemently fought the subpoena and went so far as to lie to the sheriff who came to his house that he didn't even know someone named Lashbrook. Never even heard of him. On top of that, their main target, Sidney Gottlieb, died before the office could talk to him. David Bellin, the executive director of the Rockefeller Commission, who may have been part of the alleged cover-up, also died. And then Rudolph Haley, a close friend of George White, the man who was supposed to be supervising Olson the night he died and knew about top secret information related to MKUltra, also wound up dead. Then, in 1997, a Freedom of Information Act request was answered, and a handbook executed by the CIA and DOJ in 1953, interesting year, remember, 1953, that's when Olson died, called A Study of Assassination, was made public. Let's take a look at what's written in this handbook, okay? On page 8, it begins discussing the techniques for conducting an assassination. Under section 2, it discusses accidents and says that accidents are the most effective technique for simple or chase victims. Simple means the victim is unaware, and chase means the victim is aware but unguarded. And I got those definitions from the manual itself. Under the discussion discussing accidents, it says almost immediately, the most efficient accident in simple assassinations is a fall of 75 feet or more onto a hard surface. And then it says, the act may be executed by sudden, vigorous, word removed, of the ankles, tipping the subject over the edge. Sounds like you'd push them backwards, huh? And they would land on their back, on the ground. It also says, care is required to ensure that no wound or condition not attributable to the fall is discernible after death. Given the autopsy, it looks like they really fucked up that part of the instructions. Anyways, with all of this information coming out, because the Olson sons, they saw this, they decided to file suit in the U.S. District Court in Washington, D.C. in 2012, seeking unspecified compensatory damages, as well as access to documents related to their father's death and other matters they argued the CIA withheld from them. The case was dismissed in 2013, partly because of the 1976 settlement. But U.S. District Judge James Boasberg wrote, in his decision to dismiss the suit, that while the court must limit its analysis to the four corners of the complaint, the skeptical reader may wish to know that the public record supports many of the allegations, far-fetched as they may sound. So, he was really thrown him a bone on that one, which is actually really helpful. In 2017, Netflix released a docuseries called Wormwood, based on Olson's mysterious death. In the miniseries, Seymour Hersh, a journalist, says the government had a security process to ID and execute domestic dissidents that were perceived as a risk. He claims Olson was a victim of this, and that there was an ongoing cover-up after his death. Unfortunately, Hersh explained that he could not elaborate or publish further because it would compromise his source. Scholar Michael Ignatieff, writing for the New York Review of Books, concluded, "Though I still resist the facts, as Olson's research has established, are that Alan Dulles, Richard Helms, and other unnamed persons at the highest levels of the American government ordered the death of Eric's father because they feared he knew too much about U.S. biological warfare during the Korean War and about the torture and execution of Soviet agents and ex-Nazi expendables in black sites in Europe during the early 1950s. Having killed him, the CIA concocted the story that Olson's death was a suicide brought on by stress, and later attributed his jump from the window to the effects of a cocktail laced with LSD. It now appears that the LSD was administered at a CIA retreat in Maryland to discover exactly what Olson knew. When this experiment revealed that he was indeed unreliable, he was taken to New York and disposed of. To this day, justice has not been brought for Olson's death. Robert Lashbrook, Sidney Gottlieb, and all the other senior scientists involved in this incident and also involved in MKUltra were never tried. They actually lived the rest of their lives on fat government pensions paid for by our taxpayer dollars. In addition, most documents related to MKUltra were illegally destroyed, so we don't know the full scale of the atrocities committed under the project, nor do we know how expansive it truly was. And the government swears it ended it in the 70s. But since when does the government tell the truth? And as we witnessed throughout the story, new projects are constantly being concocted by the CIA. Is this just another example of the government craftily using words to manipulate a truth that hides reality? Maybe MKUltra did end, but a successor took its place. Something more dangerous, more pervasive, and more insidious than any of its predecessors. And this video is not the end of this conversation. We are going to dive in even deeper because it gets a lot deeper. What are the most sinister projects the CIA started? How easy is it for outside entities to control our brains and thus our actions? And how does this all apply to present day? I'm going to be looking into all of that and much more in the following videos, so stay tuned. And until next time, stay safe and stay curious.